me your statutes. Give rest, O God, to the souls of your servants, and appoint for them a place in paradise.
Hello and I gotta change the layout. There we go. Hello and welcome to Logos Triumphant, episode 17. I am Spexo, here as always with PineSap, and today we have a very special guest, Classical Theist. How are you today, Classical Theist? There you go. Sorry, you were muted. How are you doing?
Yeah. How are you guys doing? I'm doing well.
Awesome. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. We are both big fans.
Yeah, good to be. I'm fans of you guys too. I think you guys do a lot of great work. It's cool. We're all cozy streamers, so
That's right. The Cozy Group is here. Biggest
Yeah.
crossover of the century. So we are going to be discussing mainly metaphysics, which is Classical Theist's basically his specialty. He's always going in depth in like very esoteric philosophical stuff, and I've been very interested in learning more about that stuff. So that's mainly going to be the topic of discussion. But as always, before anything, we are going to open with prayer. So in nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu mulieribus, benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
Awesome. So I guess the first thing I wanted to talk about with you is I recently stumbled on an old video that you did with like Jay Dyer or something, and then I watched your video with the CVS guy.
Oh yeah, that one.
Yeah, and but that was like from like 3 years ago. Now I didn't know that you you used to be an atheist. So I know that you got into like Aristotelian philosophy and stuff like that, and then you crossed over to Thomism or whatever. But like my curiosity is more so of, as an atheist, what was like the argument that made you go from saying like there is no God to now I believe there is a God?
Yeah, great. So it was, it's kind of interesting because I actually discovered it in trying to refute it. So I was, perusing online, and I came across Ed Fazier's article called "So You Think You Understand the Cosmological Argument." And of course, there are a lot of different variations of the cosmological argument. I was most familiar with what's referred to as the Kalam cosmological argument. And I still, to this day, I think that argument doesn't work. But the argument is essentially like, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe begins to exist, therefore the universe had a cause, and that cause is God. And I had spent a lot of time refuting that argument. But then I come across this article from Ed Fazier, and he went into the Thomistic versions of the cosmological argument. And I obviously knew about Thomas Aquinas, but I had basically heard about his arguments from various pop philosophy sources. You know how you take philosophy 101, and the professor just kind of goes through them really quickly, doesn't really offer the philosophical context. He just says he basically conflates St. Thomas's argument with that Kalam cosmological argument that I gave you. But when I was reading Ed Fazier's article, I was astounded by the fact that, well, St. Thomas's argument for the existence of God, you don't even have to believe that the universe began to exist in order for it to be true. And I was like, what? That threw me for a loop. I had no idea that such an argument was possible. And then when I started to look into it a little bit more deeper, I came to realize, well, it's not that they're saying, there had to be a first cause of all things, and sorry, that's thunder in the background. But there has to be a first cause of all things, and we're just going to call that God. Because it just seems like it should be called God. that's kind of the impression I got from a lot of the main presentations of those types of arguments. When I was reading through not only Ed Feser's article, but looking into it deeper and deeper and deeper, I began to realize that the Thomistic tradition in particular, and this is what I would come to discover as the classical theism tradition of approaching the existence of God, was that what you really get through the medieval tradition of arguing for God's existence is a picture of the divine that is I would say rationally argued for in every single step of the argument. So it's not so much saying that, we're going to argue for a first cause and then we're going to like shoehorn this notion of God into it. It's more saying that the logical conclusion of this argument is such that that whatever would be necessary in order to account for the existence of all things would logically have to possess attributes that we could then logically argue are divine. So it's more saying that, and we can get into the arguments in a minute if you want, but it's more saying that the logical conclusion of this argument stands on its own, and to this that we have already argued for, we are going to give the name God. And that's a different way of approaching it than what I had encountered from a lot of pop apologetics and presenting arguments for God's existence. And then, of course, discovering doctrines like divine simplicity, that God is the sheer act of existence through whom and in whom all things participate in their existence. That's a very rich understanding of the divine that I just hadn't really encountered before. It's so much rooted in our it's a logical next step from our immediate apprehension of realities that we encounter in our daily experience. We have a intuitive grasp of being. There aren't very many people who would say that being doesn't exist, or that there's no such thing as being. And it's a ladder of ascent that begins from our intuitive grasp of metaphysical truths, and using those to have this notion of God that is rooted in our intuitive grasp of these realities that we can actually articulate and talk about and experience. So it was this classical theist tradition of approaching God and approaching the existence of God that really kind of blew my mind a little bit, and was led to discover there's this way of talking about God that is thoroughly grounded in rational investigation of the cosmos.
Nice.
And that's something I hadn't really encountered before, and so that kind of led me to, at the very least, concede the existence of God. At the very least, concede that there is a transcendent source of all things. And we can refer to this transcendent source of all things as, the sheer act of being, the sheer act of existence, infinite in itself, and infinite in himself, and in whom all things participate for their existence. And we can get into what that means, what's the significance of that. But it's this metaphysically rich picture of the world that I hadn't really encountered before. A lot of arguments for God's existence that you find in like pop apologetics and such is to oftentimes try to argue for the existence of God from some kind of scientific investigation. Like, there's complexity in biology, therefore there's an intelligent designer. Are we going to explore what the metaphysical nature of this intelligent designer is? No, but for all we're concerned, it could be like aliens, or just some disembodied mind or something like that. I've heard intelligent design theorists say that, well, it could be aliens, but we're not gonna. It just has to be some intelligent being. It's like that doesn't really get to what is characteristic about the divine as divine, as this ultimate radically. It doesn't get to the radical ultimacy of divine existence, right? It's just trying to posit some entity out there somewhere that may or may not exist, but out of probability, we're just going to say likely does exist. It's almost like a Zeus character that they're arguing for. That's some big being among other beings. That's like a super intelligence that that somehow crafted the complexity of biological life. That's just very unsatisfying to me. So, well, what I was very impressed by with the Thomistic arguments is that, well, no, it's we're not trying to argue for this big mind in the sky. We're more trying to argue for a what can account for the contingency of all things, the fact that all things are dependent for the existence on other things, and what is it about this reality that truly makes it ultimate, and what truly makes this reality worthy of the name God, and that has to be that this is not just one being among many, but it is the pure act, the pure act of existence itself, in and through whom all things exist. And so, I mean, I've kind of drawn on long enough. We could talk about the significance of all that, like I said, but it's this metaphysically rich picture of the divine that led me to abandon atheism, definitely.
So it wasn't more so like, oh, I want evidence, or I want arguments for why there is a God. You were more intrigued by like the philosophical nature of what God actually is and what his attributes are.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, like when I was an atheist, the reason why I turned to atheism is in some ways the same reasons why I turned to theism at the end. Because I became an atheist because I was encountered with this picture of God that to me just added more complexity to the equation. And to me, if you just add more and more complexity, then you just get more complexity. You don't get an ultimate foundation for all things upon which everything can rest. You just get endless complexity, and it's like turtles all the way down again, right? Yep. But with this classical theistic picture of God, what it presents, you get this, you get an answer for the complexity of all things, not by turning to more complexity, but by actually turning to radical simplicity. And in a way, I was looking for absolute simplicity in what would account for the complexity of all things. Atheists think they have it with like some Darwinian explanation. Lawrence Krauss even will say that it's from nothingness, right? And that can be very appealing to the mind that is looking for simplicity as an answer to complexity. But what you come to realize is that what the atheists are actually, in my opinion, kind of looking for is this picture of explanation that that turns to a more robust notion of what simplicity would actually entail. That yes, it is simplicity that will give rise to complexity, but when you start to analyze what simplicity entails, you come to realize it actually has very divine implications about what absolute simplicity would actually have to mean, and that's what will compel you to think about things metaphysically as opposed to just physically or empirically, Gotcha. So it was exactly what you said. It was this new picture of the divine that really turned me on to theism, because it answered that question that I originally had that I didn't find an answer to, which is like how do you get how does the complexity of the universe, how can that possibly be answered by a being that's more complex? Well, in the Catholic tradition, it isn't, because God is not more complex than the cosmos. He's radically more simple than the cosmos, and it's because of his simplicity that he's actually able to give rise to the entire cosmos. But so that's kind of what led me to embrace theism.
Nice.
And I remember when I became a theist, a generic theist, I was still very much of the mind that, you know, the miraculous and supernatural claims of Christianity were absurd. I didn't want to embrace any of that. I didn't see a reason to embrace any of that. But it was really through encountering this doctrine of the incarnation and how that relates to classical theism and how it fits into it so beautifully and so richly. And that was the foundation of me embracing Christianity again, and eventually Catholicism. And I can unpack that a little bit later, but I'll let you.
Yeah, what was the argument that you said that didn't convince you? The colossum or something you said?
Yeah, it's the Kalam cosmological argument. It was put forward by. It comes out of the Islamic tradition, actually.
Yeah, that was one of the arguments that actually helped convince me of God. Like I wasn't obviously as big brained as you are with all this like philosophical stuff. Basically, it was actually William Lane Craig was one of the main things that like convinced
that's
me.
The guy I was trying to argue against like all the time. Like, when I was an atheist, I was like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And look, I'll concede that, you know, I think that if you bring into the equation this more rich understanding of God, and you use that as the conclusion of the cosmological argument. Well, my opinion is basically the cosmological argument gets you to a first cause, but it doesn't get you to God.
Yeah.
But the Thomistic arguments do. And we can explain why in a minute, maybe.
Yeah, the so basically it was like the William Lane Craig argument, basically saying like if time, space, and matter all came into existence at the same time, and every cause has something that caused it or whatever, that means that something outside of time, space, and matter had to cause it, and if there's something that exists outside of time, space, and matter, we call that God, blah blah, all that stuff. So that was like one of the main things that made me believe that there was some type of God, but that led me to, okay, well, if there is a God, which God is the right one? And then I went down like a rabbit hole and ended up on Catholicism. And now, basically like 2.5 years into being a Catholic or whatever, now I'm starting to get more interested into like the metaphysics or whatever. And so this is a good segue into the next question. Originally, I thought metaphysics was anything dealing outside like the temporal world, and it was like philosophy or virtues and other abstract concepts. But from what I've been researching, it seems that metaphysics is like specifically considered a branch of philosophy dealing with like existence and being and first cause. Is that how you would define metaphysics, or do you have like a better way to say what it is?
Yeah, so I think you're definitely on very much the right track there. A lot of people do think of metaphysics as basically the like as essentially referring to like the supernatural or to the immaterial, but that's not necessarily what it refers to. Like it is, I would argue, an intellectual gateway to transcendent immaterial realities, and immaterial realities have to be included in what metaphysics will investigate. But what metaphysics is, first I think we should back up and define philosophy, because I think if we define philosophy, we can define metaphysics as a subset of philosophy. But philosophy is, at least if you're going by the more classical, Thomistic, scholastic way of seeing things, is, I would say, situating our experience of the world within a coherent vision of the whole. So if you're dealing with empirical science or something like that, that's always investigating some empirical phenomena that is really distinguished from some other empirical phenomena. And it's always dealing with the particular. It's always dealing with it's always some subset within the physical cosmos that empirical science is investigating. Philosophy will take those experiences or observations or rational considerations that the mind will receive from its engagement with sense data, but it will try to situate those observations and that sense data within a coherent vision of the whole. Metaphysics will speak principally and primarily about the whole, as the whole. So philosophy might be dealing with how does, for example, how does like the physical constitution of matter relate to our vision of the whole of reality, right? So it might get into questions of philosophy of nature, philosophy of science. What are the it'll take the data of the scientist and then situate it in this broader vision of how do we define those terms and how do those terms relate to our vision of reality as a whole. Metaphysics is going to be much broader than that because it's going to consider the whole insofar as we consider it as the whole of reality. So it's going to start with these terms that have to be presupposed before we can even get to anything particular at all. So we start with the particular in terms of the order of our observation of the world. We're always going to be observing some particular thing first, but that will necessarily require us to ask deeper questions. So let's say we observe, where I'm looking outside and I observe a bunch of trees. Okay, well that's the physical data that we're encountering. But then you have to ask the question, okay, what is a tree? And what is a tree in contradistinction to, say, the grass? Okay, take a step back. We're also dealing on a much broader level. Okay, well we're dealing with two beings, two things, two individual things. But now we have to ask, okay, well, what does it mean to be an individual thing? What does it mean to be a thing? What does it mean to be? And that is the broadest question that we can ask. So being, which is presupposed before we consider any manner of being or any instantiation of being as being in general, is the primary subject matter of metaphysics. So we are considering beings insofar as they are beings, not insofar as they are this thing or that thing. We are considering beings or realities, if you want, insofar as they are real, insofar as they are beings. And it's metaphysics, which is that subset of philosophy that's going to apply our rational mind to that question, to examining and investigating what does it mean to be a real being. How is that question amenable to the intellect? Can the intellect answer such a question? Can it probe any deeper into? Can it break being up into its essential components, for example, and analyze how those situate in relation to our vision of the whole of reality? Those are the questions that metaphysics is going to deal with, and that's why it's so important, because it's the absolute bedrock of all things. It's the absolute bedrock of reality in general. If we can't deal with those very general, those very broad, those first principles, those first realities, how can we be expected to have a fully informed understanding of the particulars that are in front of us? So metaphysics will challenge us to think in very broad terms, which might seem easy, but it's actually in some respects harder, because you have to devote your analytical mind to things that are taken so much for granted in day-to-day experience that nobody stops to really think about and delve into and probe into their depths. So that's what I would say is the subject matter of metaphysics. The subject matter of metaphysics is being considered as being. That's what Aristotle said. It's being qua being insofar as we are speaking of being as being. essentially.
Gotcha.
So in a very long-winded explanation, I would say you were definitely on the right track there, and you basically, that exactly what you were saying. It's not so much things that are non-temporal, but it is referring to those first principles of observation, those first principles of all thought, the first principles of the real, insofar as it's real.
Gotcha. So I'm not going to keep going through chat, but you have a couple of people that are disagreeing with you. So I just want to get your take real quick. Also, if you want to ask Classical Theist a question, you could send a super chat and I'll read them at the end or whatever. But somebody says metaphysics can't be observed through our senses. Philosophy is the interpretation of our senses. And somebody says that you are conflating philosophy and empiricism.
Well, empiricism is a school of thought. Within philosophy. I mean, in empiricism, if he's talking about the debate between the rationalists and the empiricists, those are two competing schools of philosophy. So I don't know, or unless he's referring to empiricism as
apparently he wasn't referring to you. My bad. Pinesap, you want to ask your first question?
Yeah. So CT, I was maybe going to change gears, but I was trying to figure out this question online because I'm really committed to, I think, evangelizing to our Eastern separated brethren, or our Eastern Orthodox brethren who unfortunately are not in communion with the one true church. And something that I wanted to know, maybe as a basis for our conversation with these separated brethren, is did St. Gregory Palamas himself teach a real distinction between God's essences and energies, or was it that he taught like a formal distinction, like I believe Blessed Duns Scotus did, or John Scotus did, and only like the Neo-Palamites have kind of like blown it up to make it a real distinction? Would you be able to speak on that?
Yeah, it's tricky because Palamas did not speak in terms that are exactly translatable to scholastic distinctions, because when we speak of a real distinction, this whole debate about real distinction, that comes out of a set of distinctions that come from Latin scholastic philosophy. So like we have this notion of a real distinction versus a virtual distinction, or you can speak of a formal distinction, and within the virtual distinction you can speak of a minor virtual distinction or a major virtual distinction. So there's this whole categorization of distinctions that is found within scholastic philosophy that Palamas just wasn't dealing with. He didn't get into those depths. He was, in my opinion, he was just primarily trying to defend a spiritual practice. But so just to say that right off the bat is that it's tricky because we're dealing with two different thought systems, and now that being said, I do think they can be analyzed with relationship to each other intelligibly, but you have to be very careful about, because some people will say that, well, he taught a real distinction. Okay, well, Mr. Ortho, what is a real distinction? And they won't be able to really, they'll just say, oh, well, it just means it's outside the mind. Well, that doesn't translate into what the scholastic means when he says real distinction. So what a scholastic means when he speaks of a real distinction, he's referring to two beings, two entities, between which there is some non-identity. So there is a non-identity between this and that. That makes for a real distinction. There is, for example, in the Thomistic scheme, a real distinction, non-identity, between the persons of the Blessed Trinity. The Father is not the Son. The Son is not the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is not the Father. However, that does not collapse into tritheism, because the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are the divine essence. So, like in our system, there's a notional distinction, a minor virtual distinction between the persons of the Trinity and the divine essence, but a real distinction between the persons themselves. And we can discuss about how that doesn't violate simplicity if you want, but the point is that that's kind of how we have to understand the role that distinctions play in scholastic philosophy. Moving to Palamas, what we really have to ask is, in order to avoid confusion, let's get to the meaning of what a real distinction is and apply that to the Palamite distinction. Is Palamas trying to say that there is non-identity between the divine essence and the divine energies? Is that what he's trying to say? In other words, is there a mutual exclusivity of identity between the divine essence and the divine energies? Well, I think if you read Palamas, no, that's not what he's trying to say. I mean, I think that would be insane, because then you would fall into this trap where the divine essence, in other words, God as he is in himself, would infinitely transcend some aspect of God that is still supposed to be God, and yet somehow separated off from the divine essence as he is in himself. That doesn't seem to be what Palamas is trying to say, because Palamas wants to affirm some doctrine of divine simplicity. He's very adamant about affirming the doctrine of divine simplicity, and in fact, he will say that he will use the term manifestation when referring to the divine energies. And the moment he uses that word manifestation, what you have to realize is that, first of all, he uses the word manifestation. Second of all, he thinks that the divine energies on the side of God are one. On the side of the divine activities' procession towards creatures, that's when they become many. So it's in relationship to creatures that the divine activity can be considered as multiple. But on the side of the divine, it's considered as one. So really, we should be asking about what is the relationship between the divine essence and the divine energy, if we're considering this question on the side of God. And what you begin to realize is that how Palamas talks about the divine essence is a little bit different from how a Latin would talk about the divine essence. Because a Latin is going to use that word essentia. And essentia, and we can maybe get in this, I know one of the questions you want to ask is how would we define, essence versus substance versus form and matter. Mm-hmm. Well, for a Latin, essence is substance insofar as it's knowable to the intellect. So it's the substance of a thing presented to the mind as definable. The substance we could speak of as the ontological unit of existence. So a thing as it is in itself. Essence being the thing as it is in itself, presentable to us under the aspect of knowability, under the aspect of being able to define it. So essentia kind of refers to a thing's definition. Ousia, which is the Greek word that Palamas uses, is translatable to substance, the divine reality as he is in himself, considered apart from creatures, considered wholly apart from the creation of the world. And so what Palamas is really dealing with is, how are we going to speak of God as he is in himself, as distinct from God as he, insofar as he proceeds outward, outside of himself. And that's the question, it seems to me, that Palamas is trying to answer. And he's answering that question, in my opinion, as a way of exegeting Dionysius. Because that's the theologian that he draws most of his inspiration from, would be Dionysius the Areopagite. And Dionysius, and St. Thomas is also trying to exegete Dionysius. Like, St. Thomas is also very much influenced by the theology of Dionysius. So you have these two theologians that come together in their common source, which is Dionysius the Areopagite. And if you read St. Thomas's exegesis on the divine names of Dionysius, he says that, we can consider the divine union as one consideration, but another consideration would be the divine processions. The divine processions that that come to meet creation. In other words, God, as he is in himself, is this trinity of persons. He is this internal and eternal play of manifestation and union within himself from all eternity. God is always self-communicative. God is always self-emptying. He's always self-manifesting within himself from all eternity. But he is also self-manifesting in his outward procession towards creatures. And so there's that question we have to ask, which is, from the standpoint of creatures, when God proceeds outward toward us, how are we to categorize these divine operations that come to meet us, right? And that's where St. Thomas is going to say, and I think Palamas roughly agrees, although he formulates it in a different way, of course, and in a way that maybe one could argue is more amenable to the Scotus position. Maybe. I mean, I don't know, but maybe. Either way, if it's amenable to the Scotus position, that's still within Catholic tradition, right? But, St. Thomas will look at that and he will say, whatever distinction that we're going to make, say, between these various divine manifestations that come to meet us, it's a distinction that's made as a result of creation in its finite, fragmented mode, receiving this reality that exists in transcendental simplicity, as he is in himself. So, because God is absolutely simple, because he is transcendent, because he is infinitely transcendent of all things, and absolutely simple in himself, composed of no parts whatsoever, in order for creation to receive this divine reality, to engage with this divine reality, well, it has to receive the divine according to its own mode, and according to its own fragmented and composed and finite mode. So it has to do that according to a multiplicity of operations, according to a multiplicity of distinctions and names and energies, right? So the divine energy will diversify according as the mode of the recipient receives him. And so when you come to think about it that way, then you realize, okay, well, there's definitely not a non-identity between the divine energy and the divine essence. The divine energy is the divine essence insofar as the divine essence manifests himself to us and to creation. And you could even say maybe within himself, but again, considered as a notional distinction there, because again, God as he is in himself is simple. God as he is in himself is one and simple and non-composed. So the divine activity within himself is one and the same with his essence. I think the Thomistic way of talking about that is actually unique and sublime and beautiful, because what St. Thomas will say is that in God, essence and existence coincide. And what is existence but an act? Existence is an act. So in God, for St. Thomas, you could say God transcends essence and energy, because he's so infinitely transcendent. He transcends the static nature of an essence, but he also transcends the purely dynamic nature of an operation or an activity. And we can get a glimpse of this by studying his metaphysical system, because in his metaphysical system, it's the act of existence is the most fundamental reality. The act of existence is what gives actuality to substance. It's what gives actuality to form and matter within the substance. And the act of existence has to be considered an act. It's not a static essence. It is an act, but it's also not like the activity of an essence, because the activity of an essence is beneath the essence, as it were. Like, in other words, my activity flows from what I am as a person. My activity flows from my substance, right? I think we understand that. Like, my activity flows from who I am as a human being, and my activity is proper to who I am as a human being. So my substance precedes my activity, as it were. right? So the act of existence, it's the actuality. It's the principle of actuality whereby a substance is, and it's the principle of actuality whereby a substance can act. So mystically and mysteriously, the act of existence in created things transcends both these categories of substance and activity. Much more so with God, infinitely more so with God. God, because essence and existence coincide in him, he is the pure act of existence. Within him, we can't map on this distinction of essence and energy to God. We're trying to map on our finite our finite concepts that are within our intellectual horizon onto God when we do that, and we can't do that. God is infinitely beyond those, even that distinction itself. So ironically, a lot of Neo-Palamites like to say that the West is more rationalistic and the East is more mystical. This is the deepest mysticism. This is the deepest apophaticism. Apophatic meaning the way of negation, the way of negating our positive understanding of all things in order to strip God of anything that would limit him, of anything that would be a limitation of his existence. This view, in my opinion, safeguards that much more so than acting as if God can answer to our distinction between essence and energy. So, I mean, I've rambled on long enough. Hopefully that wasn't too...
No, man. I will be honest with you, CT, you know this. My area is like papal apologetics. When it comes to metaphysics, I'm like... Me and
well, like I have a habit of just going on and on and on, not realizing if people are not fully processing what I'm saying, because sometimes I explain things that are a bit too in my head, but not necessarily.
It's big brain moments. Everybody in my chat. Everybody in my chat.
But I'm not trying to do that. Like that's the thing. People think I'm.
No, it's super interesting. Somebody said that it was classical Theist ASMR because you just sound nice with the words you're putting together.
Okay, what would be the alternative, CT? You just being here like yeah, and then dead silence. Like we love hearing you talk, man. I just wanted you to know if I couldn't follow that up, it's just because I am, as Spexo says, I'm a grub brain Catholic, right? I'm like. Me look at Vatican and do what Man in Tiara says or something like that.
But yeah, the people in the chat that are saying like you can't follow him or whatever. A lot of people everybody loves what you're saying and stuff like that. But a lot of people are like I have no idea.
Well, by all means, ask more questions. Yeah. I'll try to.
But I just think it's funny because I'm right there with you guys. Like I'm there. I understood like 40% of what he said, but it sounds awesome.
Spexo, would you be okay if I kind of ask?
Yeah, keep going.
A follow-up
question?
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, kind of based on what I could ascertain, CT, with my very limited knowledge of metaphysics, it kind of sounds like, if we were to have like almost a neo-Florence, like a neo-Council Florence, and like all the whole pentarchy attends, right. and they're like, we're coming back into communion with Blessed Peter, and we're, the entire East comes back into communion. I based on what I was hearing from you, and based on the bit of history that I know, like Pope Eugene IV, like during Florence, not really having a problem with Palamas, as far as I know, and
doesn't really
saying
come
that
up.
He was all good. It sounds like he's not an obstacle to reunion at all.
No, and see that's the thing. I resent the fact that people feel the need to bring this up to me. It seems like such a waste of discussion. Okay, I'll be honest. Originally, when I first started looking into this issue, I thought it was refreshing because I thought that like someone like Jay Dyer, for example, was getting at an issue that was a little bit more fundamental than like papal apologetics or something like that. But when you really look into it, you begin to discover, well, there's no obstacle for reunion on the basis of this issue. I mean, for example, like Scotus and St. Thomas, they articulate divine simplicity somewhat differently. Primarily because of how Scotus understands divine infinity as distinct from Aquinas. Aquinas thinks of it in a more negative way. Scotus thinks of it in a more positive way, and that will color how they understand divine simplicity, either negatively or positively. And we could discuss about what that means. I just didn't see it as terribly important to explain because it's not pertinent to discussion. But point is, Scotus and St. Thomas, they can articulate divine simplicity differently. The dogmatic definitions on simplicity, what they require you to believe is that God is altogether simple. That's the phraseology that it uses. So he uses that in the Vatican I. I believe it uses it in Florence, but I could be mistaken. I don't know if it refers to all the simplicity of God in Florence, but I do know that it's defined dogmatically in Vatican I. But if you think about what altogether simple means, it really just means that in no way can we say that God is composed of either metaphysical or physical parts. In other words, all that God is all that he is. Okay? There's no aspect of God that is not fully the divinity. In other words, God is his own divinity. God is his own nature. God is his own being. God is his own existence. There cannot be any dimension of the divinity that has to receive some perfection. In other words, because that would be the case if he was composed of parts. If God was composed of any parts, then the parts would receive the perfection of the whole, right? And therefore there would be a dependency within the Godhead, and that cannot obtain for God. You know, people might bring up the persons of the Trinity, but the persons of the Trinity are not parts of God. The reason why they're not parts of God is because they are consubstantial. They are one in being. They are not really distinct from the essence of God. If they were, then we would have tritheism. We would have this notion that God is composed of three different parts, as a stool it maintains its structure with its legs, right? That is characteristically not divine. The divine is defined by his simplicity. So that's what you have to believe as a Catholic. And certainly Palamas, in my opinion, he doesn't necessarily violate that. Certain interpretations of Palamas may well violate that, but certainly not necessarily. And in my opinion, like the early Palamites, they certainly didn't hold to a vision of simplicity that would in any way be in conflict with the Vatican definition.
You know, I was reading about it too, and I'm not sure if you know him, but do you know a gentleman by the name of Duong on YouTube? He's he's a fairly new up and coming, I think, Catholic apologist. He made a 2-hour video on the Church Fathers teaching the Filioque, which is really, really good. Yeah. And I shared his Essences and Energies distinction video where he shows actually the discontinuity between like the early Palamites and the Neo-Palamites in a way that's like, it's a 2-minute video. It's like so good. But like, one of Palamas's disciples, like what he seemed to enunciate to me about that distinction, I was like, I think that's perfectly tenable in Catholic theology. And I think if like we reject that aberrant sort of like Neo-Palamite Neo-Palamism that kind of came at like the Slavophile movement of the 19th century.
Yeah, well, it came out of rhetoric. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, it was born out of anti-Latin rhetoric, and it seems to be. They had to find, like, you know, on our side, we had Aeterni Patris of Leo XIII, which was meant to begin, or it was meant to revive Thomism as a way to fight culture wars, in a way, as a way to sort of defend like the integrity of Catholic thought against the modern West. Very, very noble goal, in my opinion. But we have Aeterni Patris, and they revive Neo-Palamism, Palamism as this way to sort of distinguish itself from everything else. And you know, I've spoke about this before, but that can be the lazy person is going to be very attracted to that because what it would basically do is it would reduce the schism to this metaphysical issue that you could solve from the armchair. If we could get palimism, if this palimism idea contradicts sacred scripture, or not sacred scripture, if this palimism idea contradicts a dogmatic definition of the Roman Catholic Church, then the Roman Catholic Church is false if palimism is true, and then you're done. That's all the work you got to do. You're done. You've done it from the armchair. You don't have to delve into all of these historical documents about the papacy or filioque or anything like that. You just cracked the code. You got it. It's good. It's very attractive to a lazy person. It's also it's also an understandable. It's also understandably attractive to someone who is kind of just worn out by all of this endless quote mining, all of this endless historical debates that are just very tiring, and you can't seem to get to the bottom of it. It's just you get your source, the other guy has his source, and it's just like it's kind of like the theological equivalent of I'mRight.com, and it's very difficult when you get into those debates. But unfortunately, that's kind of where the issue has to be settled. I mean, like I wish that there was just some metaphysical knockdown argument that would solve the East and West schism, but there isn't one. It does come down to an issue of authority and what are the primitive apostolic elements of ecclesiology, and what can be discerned from that, and is that in congruence with what's defined at Vatican I, or isn't it? And that's the question that alone will adjudicate all of these issues, because if that's adjudicated on that level, then when Pope Eugene IV and the Council of Florence come out with their dogmatic definitions, then it's settled by virtue of the authority of the papacy that can be discerned. So unfortunately, and I don't like it either, because it's tiring, but the debate has to be had on that level. I mean, I used to not think that, but I definitely think that now. Like, the debate has to be settled on that. Now that's respect to East and West schism alone, because I think there are a lot of metaphysical arguments that you can use to definitely establish Christianity. And I've talked about that at length. I think that's like, if I have any contributions in my internet persona, it's the argument for the incarnation that I've had on my channel. But in terms of East and West schism, no, it's got to be historical.
I really think so too, and that's why I try to, because the metaphysical arguments, it kind of seems like a rabbit hole, honestly. Like, you can just like go on and on and on forever, and it's just gonna be the different ways people interpret text, and they're gonna throw out this scholar and that scholar and stuff like that. And so really, it's funny, because like Jeremiah Bannister has acted kind of like a mentor to like me and Spexo and stuff like that on Catholic presuppositionalism. And I always say, I think for like an atheist or something, I think metaphysics is really where you focus to get them to believe in Christ. I think for a non-Catholic Baptist Improve Peter's Petrine ministry, I think everything from there becomes like a catechism lesson, essentially. It's like,
yeah, it does. And, I think with Protestants, with non-sacramental Protestants, I think you can make a lot of good arguments from fitness. And if I don't mean fitness in the sense of lifting, but fitness in the sense of what's fitting. Those are very powerful arguments, in my opinion. We underestimate them if we don't use them, because God is a God of doing what is wise. God will always do what is wise. God will always do what is fitting, according to His wisdom. And if you can establish philosophically that something is inescapably fitting, I think that's a good argument. It may not be a knockdown argument, but I think it's a good argument. And I think you can do that, for example, with the sacramental life of the Church. For example, like, an argument that I kind of like to use is that the sacramental dimension of the church is kind of an extension of the logic of the incarnation itself, right? Like God saw fit to unite himself with the material cosmos in the human nature of Jesus Christ. So likewise, our participation in this incarnation should be incarnational as well. And the sacramental dimension of the church, which incorporates the use of externals and matter and a hierarchically visible institution, these things are come together very fitting, that they fittingly complement the incarnational metaphysics of Christianity. So if you use an argument like that against a non-sacramental Protestant, I think it's a good way to go. But I mean, Orthodox are sacramental people, so you really are your space of your space is narrowed in terms of which arguments can adjudicate the dispute, and I think it does come down to history.
Absolutely. Spexo, I have another question when it's my turn, but if you have a question for CT, go right ahead, man.
Yeah, sure. So real quick, I want to take a quick detour from metaphysics real quick that I wanted to ask you. So obviously all three of us are America First supporters. I actually heard of you before I knew that you were even like a supporter of America First. And since Pine Sap and I have started this podcast, we've kind of gotten a little attention from other online Catholic people and stuff like that. And a contention or a controversy that we've dealt with are people that are Catholic, but they are definitely not supporters of America First. So we generally have to defend Groypers and defend why we support
Well, like I get attacked for defending it, but I'll do it all day.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's basically what I wanted to ask you is like, so we defend it all the time. Basically, obviously, it's like the only movement that is really founded on Catholic morality. Nick Fuentes has never, perpetuated or like endorsed something that was like against the Catholic faith or anything like that and stuff like that. And we go over how he uses irony and jokes and blah blah and stuff like that. But I was wondering like what is your like arguments of like people that will say like, oh well, he's racist and he made these Holocaust jokes and he did this, that is anti-Catholic, he hates women and he does this blah blah. What do you say to people that say stuff like that?
I want to say first and foremost that when you listen to Nick talk about the faith, if you're attentive, you'll come to realize the way he explains the faith in his words is clear evidence that he is someone who thinks about the faith day in and day out. He is someone and he thinks about it at a very high level. He may not be a theologian, and he doesn't pretend to be. He has a lot of other things to do than read theology books. However, when you listen to him talk about the faith, when you listen to him talk about the Christian foundations of his entire worldview, the Catholic foundations of his entire worldview, this is somebody who takes the faith very seriously. He thinks about he doesn't compartmentalize the faith. Like, you have the faith here, but then you have my practical life over here. No, it's all interwoven, tied together, integrally united in one coherent whole for him. And I've just always encountered that with him. And you notice this because a lot of people who aren't very like serious Catholics will they will kind of speak very loosely about things, not really caring if it contradicts Catholic doctrine. And then, like, when they're directly asked about Catholic doctrine, they'll say, oh yeah, I'm Catholic. Nick doesn't do that because he's very keenly aware of what is Catholic and what is not Catholic, and he will make sure that everything he says, that's meant to be taken seriously, obviously. Again, we understand jokes, we understand the use of irony. For example, like, when he says Hunter Biden is based, like, this is obviously
irony. He's using it to show a different point.
A use of humor to exaggerate an underlying truth.
Yeah.
Or something like that. But obviously, if you asked him, like, is it a good thing to,
smoke crack,
have prostitutes or something, and he would obviously know, and he does say that. So it's like, this is somebody who thinks about the faith on a deep level. This is somebody who has integrated the truths of the faith seamlessly within his worldview. He also, he prays the rosary. He goes to mass, confession. He participates in the sacramental life of the church. He's also obedient to the magisterium. He's obedient to the Pope. He will never bash the Pope. He will never bash the post-conciliar church. He will recognize that he's not a fan of Pope Francis. I'm not a fan of Pope Francis. But he's very careful. He's a careful thinker when it comes to the faith, and we need someone like that at the helm. We need someone at the helm who is able to recognize on a very intuitive level what is of the faith and what is not of the faith, and that we have to ultimately be directionally pushing for a society that is congruent with the truths of the faith versus a society that's incongruent with the truths of the faith. And I feel like he's actually like even strengthening that resolve in recent
I feel that too.
Months, because he's very much
more vocal about it, his faith.
I think he's increasingly more vocal about the necessity of Catholic elements in like this America First movement. Now, we all recognize that there has to be a degree of
pragmatism.
Pragmatism.
Did you see what he said the other day?
Ecumenical.
He did one podcast, right, where the girl, where he said he was Catholic, and then he asked the girl that was on the interview or whatever if she was Christian or whatever, and she was like, yeah, I'm Protestant. And he was like, oh, I'm sorry, I'll pray for you or something. And then the other day he said something along the lines of like, if you're a non-denominational Protestant, you might as well be worshiping crystals or something like that.
Yeah, I actually haven't been able to catch the recent shows. I've just been so busy. But I'll have to watch that on the commute that I make. But yeah, like I just think, okay, so of course that's kind of to preface how I see Nick as a person. I see him as very so someone who takes the faith very seriously. He's obviously, he's eccentric, but he's an eccentric genius, in my opinion. It's the eccentric people who you need to change the world. It's the eccentric people who are the ones who are going to be the movers and shakers. Look at all of the movers and shakers of today. Look at people like Elon Musk. Look at people like Donald Trump. These are eccentric people. These are the oddballs in a good way. And the beauty about someone like Nick is that he does have that like eccentric edge to him, but he's also very much fully immersed in the sacramental life of the church, and in so doing, he will carry with his success our success as Catholics, as Catholics who want to see a Christianized and Catholicized United States. So the more we root for him in what he's trying to do and what he's gradually accomplishing year by year by year. I mean, just look at the exponential growth of this thing. Yep. It's massive. What he's been able to do, it's really a no-brainer. If you are a reactionary Catholic who wants to see a societal move toward accepting gradually or what have you Catholic political outcomes, then it's a no-brainer to support him. And look, I mean, if you think that he has said things that are like racially insensitive, or you're of that kind of mind that is a bit more for lack of a better term, infused with like
gayness,
normie sentiments about these issues, such as race or what have you. To me, it's like what's more important, your sentiments about race, or furthering the evangelization through this political vehicle of America First. And look, I mean, if you want, like, we could examine what he's actually said about race and how it's not in conflict with what the magisterium has said. But I mean, that might take a bit long. But I mean, I'd just say refer to this article I wrote about it on the race in the magisterium.
Yeah, excellent. That was one of the first things I saw from you. It's called
So
on race in the magisterium. What is that? What is that website that I was on? Just look up on race in the magisterium by
you'll find it.
Middle Earth
Middle Earth
Mag.
Magazine. Yeah, I wrote it for them. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also I posted a
that book.
I posted by Father Hinwood, by Father Bonaventure Hinwood.
Yeah, we've talked about that numerous times on the show, actually. It's on Classical Theist's page. You said that you have like the only actual physical copy, right? And like you had somebody transcribe it and you uploaded the PDF.
Yeah, my fiance actually, I had the only physical copy that I think you can get your hands on, and she actually typed the whole thing out in PDF format.
That's awesome.
So the whole thing is there, and it's really good, because that's one of those rare instances where you see a very comprehensive theological engagement with this issue that is not in any way polluted with modern emotional sentiments. It's written in the 60s. This guy he lived in South Africa, and this was like a theological dissertation. This was his theological dissertation. So he's thinking about things in a very soberly minded way, and when you read this treatise, you're immediately faced with the superabundance of magisterial citations that he offers. He will go very deep into like papal addresses and allocutions that aren't even magisterial, but are nevertheless informative about the mind of the Pope. Like he'll talk about how Pius XII's address to like the International Society for Blood Transfusion is relevant to like a Catholic understanding of like the metaphysics of race or something. Like this guy, props to him. Like he died in 2016 actually, but props to him, because I think like one of my missions is to popularize this book, is like make it more popular, because like I said, he gives a very, very theologically rich and philosophically informed and magisterially rooted understanding of race, while avoiding all of the excesses that are, I guess, prevalent for like Wignats or whatever, but also avoiding the
blindness, racial blindness. Right?
Yeah, exactly. The racial blindness, the overly sentimentalized, egalitarian interpretation of race that completely ignores any and all like accidental variation or anything like that. And he actually says like that. He says this, like he says we have to avoid any kind of over exaggeration of racial differences that would in any way compromise the fundamental unity of all mankind, while also avoiding the recently emerging temptation to see race as just a matter purely of like pigmentation. He actually says that.
I think you should. There's this website where you could actually turn PDFs into like actual books, and I think you could make them so that they could be like made to order or whatever. You should try to look into that. You could probably get like a lot of people to buy that.
I'd have to look into like what copyright law would have to say about that, but that's been suggested to me before, and I have thought about it.
Based. Go ahead, Pine you wanna.
What was I? Oh man, there was one thing I was gonna ask, and then I totally. My mind just like went phooey, but really trying to think. You know who Nick kind of reminds me of, CT? This is like a church history kind of nerd comment. He kind of honestly reminds me of Louis Veillot a little bit.
Yeah, expand on that a bit.
Well, because like Louis Veillot was this like firebrand, right? Like in the mid 19th century that like really was just like, you know, Catholicism, and he was like writing, you know, these massive newspapers in France and stuff like that. And he was so Catholic that he would just like support whatever political movement and stuff like that seemed to best represent the faith. Like I remember there was like a Bourbon monarch or what have you that like kind of like disdained the church a little bit, and he said like if the kings no longer have need of Catholicism, then this world no longer has need of kings. And he was just like he's just like laying it out. But like the reason I make that connection, and he's a very like not well known figure and stuff like that. But you know me, I like to bring up the nerdy like super figure stuff. But like the reason that Nick really reminds me of him is because like he has this. He really has this like plentitude of like holy fire within him. You know what I mean? Like this like fire that does not singe the church's body, but rather singes those who go against the church, right? Those things which seem to cry out to heaven for vengeance. And you know, really through like what Nick has been like making and stuff like that, like I see this like revival of really the like 19th century conflict of not only like Louis Veillot, but like a bunch of other like Catholic figures emerge once again, where we see the more like at that time it was a lot less, you know, bad than it is now, but like almost like how those things became what we're dealing with today, right? Like
well, there was this very concentrated effort to consolidate our tradition to use as a weapon against this newly emerging secularizing society. And you saw this with the new liturgical movement, for example. And you know, I see Nick as playing a major role in what you kind of see as like a revival of that impulse that was I think was lost after the council, but is kind of coming back a bit.
I know what I was going to say, and I want to see if you'll agree with me on this. I was sorry, it just came back to me because it was this thought exactly. I remember shortly before Vatican II that St. John the 23rd wrote this encyclical. I can't remember what it's called for the life of me, but it was like against communism, and it was against like secularism. And that was like one of the earlier invocations of ecumenism that would be talked about at the council, right? In Unitatis.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, but I don't remember the name.
Dude, it is escaping you and I. Like, I can't remember the Latin name, but I know that Unum Sanctum Catholicum was talking about this on his blog and how like based of an encyclical it was. And the ideas in that encyclical of like uniting Christians by baptism with Catholics in order to ultimately make them Catholic and stuff like that. I really think that like AF is exactly that, because like I've, you know, since me and Spexo started the show and stuff like that, I've really been doing I've really been seeing so many people like come forward and even these like really hardcore Protestant people and stuff like that. And they'll like come forward and be like, you know, I never really considered like the need for like churchy authority, or like I was reading my Bible and it's like, why does the letter, you know, Paul's letter to the Hebrews say like, be subject to your prelates and stuff like that. And I almost think that like the ecumenical vision of St. John the 23rd that like he wanted is almost coming alive in this movement. Would you agree with that? Or like, what are your thoughts on that?
Something's wrong with your audio, CT.
Oh, sorry. Is it good now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm saying I do agree with you actually, and I think John the 23rd, he gets a bad rap just because he's associated with the council. But if you read his writings, if you read his magisterial writings, they're quite rich actually, and he doesn't get enough credit. He wrote this entire encyclical defending the liturgical use of Latin, for example. Um, and I think you're right though about AF kind of truly exemplifying ecumenism as it was intended to be exemplified. I think there is this the threat of secularism. I think is so dangerous that we do have to sort of band together as those in communion with the true church and those separated brethren, but with the intention of impelling the separated brethren towards Catholic unity, which is what Lumen Gentium talks about. And I think that AF is one of those movements where, I see it all the time where, Protestants get involved. Gradually, they're just, I think, encouraged and prompted to become Catholic, and it happens all the time. And you could tell that, like in something like AF, it's Catholic in character, even though it's not to the exclusion of Protestants.
Yes.
But Protestants are kind of they intuitively recognize that they'll enter this movement and they'll I'm speaking a little bit metaphorically, but they'll get a whiff of the incense. They'll get a whiff of they'll get a sense of Catholic imagery, Catholic ways of talking, Catholic ways of thinking, and that kind of an atmosphere is inescapable. And I think by osmosis, they do feel this prompting. I think of the Holy Spirit, but they wouldn't necessarily admit that. But this prompting to exemplify in fullness what the actual movement is, I think, in its underlying structure.
Yeah, I think you see with how many people have converted, like in AF, people that weren't Catholic and have said that like Nick and America First have like made them want to become Catholic and things like that. And you go to these AF rallies and these events and you see people holding crucifixes and saying the rosary and all this stuff. It is like fully centered on Jesus Christ, which is the main thing that like got me interested.
You know what it also is? What's
up?
It's new. Mm-hmm. It's new for America because usually Christianity and politics in America is associated with like Protestant Tea Partyism and like moral majority of the 80s, televangelists,
yep.
This sort of Southern pride variant of Protestantism, very low church aesthetics, and that's been done before. And I do feel like the Catholic element of America First that is also touched with an edge to it, an edge to it. There's this aggression in it as well, specifically in the Catholicity of the movement. So like you can't do what BAP does and just like accuse it of being like the reincarnation of Rick Santorum, because it's not that. Like Nick's Catholicism is aggressive, kind of in your face. It is it's unpolished. I don't mean in the sense of being imprecise, but it's not trying to color inside the lines of
it's real.
It's not fusionism. Yeah, it's not fusionism. It's not the fusionism of Rick Santorum, where like the idea is to basically return to like Pope John Paul II and Ronald Reagan working in tandem together to defeat communism. He's wanting much more than that, like because he doesn't want the United States to retain its its secular character while just being kind of nice to the church.
So true.
And that's a new dynamic. That's a new level of political discourse that had previously been unexplored, I think, specifically in the right. And we're we're seeing it in somebody like Nick really going all the way with this. And it's uncharted waters, and for that reason it's exciting. And in a way that Protestantism, in a way that like American Protestantism, it can't engender that kind of excitement. Because Protestantism is always going to be, I think, subservient and a subset of the broader uh, of the broader political structures that house it. Whereas Catholicism, being rooted in a political superstructure in its own right, it's gonna house this. It is supposed to house the secular political order, not the other way around. And it has the power to do that because it is an institutional religion. Um, so, yeah, those are just kind of my thoughts on that.
Based.
Well, CT, it all comes down to, I really think that because of how bad things have gotten, it's reminding us the very root of politics, which, is the old Cardinal Manning quote that Hilaire Belloc shared, right? That all human conflict is ultimately theological. And what else do you see between like Peter Crompkin starting out his book on anarchism with dedicating it to Satan and saying, oh, this is dedicated to the original, rebel, right? And then, the early anarchists in America being, creating that horrid magazine called Lucifer the Light Bearer and stuff like that. Like, because in our time of kind of like, for lack of a better term, riding on the coattails of really, I think honestly, the spiritual wealth the medieval ages brought us, like politics or virtue in politics could be seen almost in this kind of like secular, like Aristotelian way, where it's just like, the old adages you would hear from like your grandparents or something like, do a good turn daily or be nice to your neighbor or something like that. But when those very structures started to be challenged and they were falling away, and be nice to your neighbor meant, well, let your neighbor mutilate his genitals and read at a children's function or whatever, it's like suddenly those foundations were stripped away and we're left with like, what is the very like metaphysical ramification of politics and where does that start? And it's as you said, like, this is rising because, as E. Michael Jones says, Logos is rising, right? Like from the ashes, this phoenix of the Holy Spirit is rising in us to really reclaim politics under the banner of heaven, under the banner of Jesus Christ, and not just this like lottie-dottie, kind of generic dialectic on conservatism you would have heard like 60 years ago or whatever,
Right, and I think what you said is important, that politics is ultimately theological, and that's true because it's not just politics that's theological. A tree blowing in the wind is theological ultimately, because God has supreme causality over all things, and everything is ultimately derived from God. And that everything participates in its active existence, and its active existence is ultimately a participation in the divine existence, which covers all things, and nothing can escape its grasp without being reduced to absolute nothingness. So God has supreme dominion over all things in the natural order, and therefore he has to have supreme dominion over all things in the in the political order as well, even as he has dominion over all things in our personal moral lives in addition to that. So really secularism is atheism, and if we're going to be committed to this notion that all things derive their existence from God, then political authority does too. And political authority has to yield itself to the divine, and the divine has become incarnate in Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ is present on this earth sacramentally and through the mystical body. Therefore, the mystical body is that perfect society to which all imperfect societies must yield in order to have a political order that's even coherent, let alone conducive to flourishing. So definitely.
So we got a super chat from Don't Care Charles. He says, "Classical Theist, what is the best way to get started in metaphysics for a guy who knows nothing about philosophy, metaphysics, etc.?"
I think Edward Fraser is a really good start for somebody who is like an absolute beginner. You know, I started with his books. I started with his last Superstition book, and then I would recommend his book on Aquinas. I think the goal should be to go beyond Fraser, but for someone who's really starting out, I think Fraser is really good. He's very understandable. He's accessible.
What's his name? Yeah, because you gave me this book by, what is his name? Ezell or something? Edward. What's the book you told me? The Philosophy of Thomas Aquinas.
Oh yeah, that's Etienne Gilson. In hindsight, I think I would recommend Fraser before someone read Gilson.
Yeah, I was reading the first chapter. It was talking about reality and existence, and like already like with like the presupposed notion that you have any idea what these terms mean. And I was like, what am I reading?
Yeah. In hindsight, I kind of forgot about the very first chapter of that book, which is kind of the hardest chapter of the book, honestly. But yeah, I think for someone really starting out, I would go with somebody like Ed Fraser. I actually have I have no idea where to find it anymore, but actually maybe just bear with me for 1 second. Ah, here it is, actually. I got it. I have a book list that I put together a long time ago. So I can just read a couple of these. If people are, listening, they can, in a replay, you can pause the video or whatever, because this is kind of the book list that I put together in the order of starting as a beginner and getting more and more intermediate. So actually starting with Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide by Edward Fraser. And then Frederick Copleston wrote a book called Aquinas, which is very good. F.C. Copleston is one of the best historians of philosophy that's really ever lived. And he died a long time ago, but he has a really good, small, very short book on Aquinas. Then there's Reginald Garrigue-Lagrange's book, Reality, A Synthesis of Thomistic Thought. That's good after you read those other two. Then The Christian Philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas by Etienne Gilson. That's the one I recommended to you. Man's Knowledge of Reality by Frederick D. Wilhelmsen. That gives you a very good insight into St. Thomas's epistemology. So like how we can know things. How does the mind know things? His realism about universals and the natures of things. Then Copleston's History of Philosophy, Volume 2 on medieval theology, or medieval philosophy from Augustine to Scotus. There's a tour of the Summa by Paul J. Glenn. That's a very good book that kind of gives brief summaries of the articles in the Summa. That's very understandable. And then what you really want to get, maybe you can get this like right away, and it can maybe help you as you're reading through all this other stuff, is the Dictionary of Scholastic Philosophy by Bernard Weltner. That's one of those very rare books that is literally a dictionary of the scholastic terms that are used.
Yeah, that's actually I didn't use that, but what I did was, so I was reading the book that you recommended to me, and anything that I didn't like understand like what the actual like word meant, right? Like, hold on, I want to show it on my screen real quick. So I have like this list. You can't see it. Oh, right, of all like metaphysical terms. So it says like, what is existence? An act of being. What is a substance? A unit of existence, something that exists by itself. Man, dog, tree. Accidents, attributes of substances that aren't necessary for the substance existence. So like I was like basically breaking down like every term that like I didn't understand what the context was, and that's like how my grug brain was able to like comprehend some of the stuff I was reading.
That's the way like any smart person will do it. Is they will stop and see. I'm very big on this idea that like it's not so much how much you read,
Mm-hmm.
it's what you read and how long you take to think about what you read.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what really is what makes you like a valuable thinker, in my opinion. You know, because people can have this vast library of books, say, "Oh, I've read all these
Mm-hmm.
books." It's like, well, okay, maybe you did, but did you skim through a lot of it? Did you really take the time to think about what you've read? Did you take the time to make sure that you've understood it before you moved on to the next thing? Uh, it takes a lot of humility to do that, and I think like what you did with like writing down those terms or just writing about what they mean, like that's how you do it. Like that's like that's not that's the smart way to do it
Mm-hmm.
is to make sure that you're getting what you read before you move on to the next thing. A lot of people, uh, I used to do this myself, just like if I just read a lot, I'll understand. Well,
Mm-hmm.
no, it's not how much you read. It's the biggest challenge is trying to figure out what to read, because you can only read so much in your life, and you have to be figure out what's valuable and not what's not valuable, because time is so precious. But then in addition to that, it's making sure that like uh, you absolutely understand what you're reading before you move on. Even if you have to take a walk, think about it. That's going to be more valuable in the long run than just like reading a bunch of books, filling your head with things that you don't even understand. You don't even know how they relate to one another,
Mm-hmm.
and just so you can say you've read all these books. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
that'll make you feel better about yourself, but it's not actually gonna
I
help
used I
anybody
used to do
or
that a lot
yourself.
too. Like when I first got into reading or whatever, I bought like a bunch of books and like read them in like a week or whatever. And I was like, oh, I read all these books and like, oh, well, tell me about this one. It was like I could only tell you maybe
Yeah,
about two of them. You know what I'm
you
saying? Like,
forget it
yeah,
all. Like I've done
exactly.
that myself. It's like
Mm-hmm.
okay, I read through this book really fast.
Mm-hmm.
How much did I understand? Maybe
Yeah.
10%.
Pine Sap's the opposite.
And
He's like a robot. He just retains like encyclopedias of information. But
actually, I wish I had an encyclopedic memory. I don't. I'm envious of people who do. Like that's such a powerful skill.
mm-hmm.
CT, I would say that you have a pretty encyclopedic memory, man. I think that you're not giving yourself enough credit. Although I don't want to tempt you to pride as a lot of the Greek fathers tell us the
Right, yeah.
spiritual
Well,
things.
I mean, like I have a okay long-term memory, horrible short-term memory. I have to compensate for my like bad working memory with with taking a lot more time to think through things than other people. But yeah, no, I mean we all have our own unique kind of gifts and shortcomings and all that stuff.
So
But I hope that book list was helpful. I have like some other
absolutely,
things listed here,
I'm gonna look into that
but I
Fraser
mean,
book. Maybe I'll read. Maybe I'll start reading that and then go back to the Esteel book.
yeah. But I would also say, so after you've read some of these other books, uh, don't hesitate to just read St. Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
Like like
Oh yeah,
uh,
definitely.
like I know that when you read his metaphysical works, they're difficult. But like when you've read some of this background literature, read him. It's just like
You can get the full
and
unabridged Summa Theologica
yeah,
on Kindle for $1. Like I
you
have it.
can.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
I mean,
actually that was easier. I'm having an easier time reading Aquinas himself than a Steele on Aquinas.
yeah, I mean, yeah, like honestly, that's definitely true. Because you know he does, um, he's very difficult to understand when he talks about more higher end metaphysical ideas in some
Hmm.
of his more philosophical works. But like for example, just reading the Summa, a lot of the Summa is actually very understandable.
Yeah, definitely.
Um, and you know, it's really just getting a sense of how he thinks, what he says, and then think for yourself about what you think it means. Because you know there are like uh, as many interpretations of what Thomas says as there are Thomists. So, um, you know, that's one of those things where you get into the world of Thomism, you realize, well, a lot of these people don't even agree with each other about what Thomas means about various things. But
So why do you think that? Why should people be interested in metaphysics? Like, especially since there's so many different schools of thought that are accepted, and you know, it's not like necessary for salvation or whatever. Why shouldn't someone just say like I kind of jokingly say it's like, oh, I'm a grog-brained Catholic. I do what the church tells me to do. I don't need to get into all the intricacies and stuff like that. What do you think the benefits and the importance of like trying to learn about this stuff is?
yeah, I think it's indispensably important. Not necessarily, like you said, not for salvation, um, but when you really take a while to think about things on that metaphysical higher level of reality, then you can deepen your appreciation for the things of God. You know, like for example, when you think about reality on that metaphysical level, you come to realize the radical contingency of all things. The things are dependent for their existence. In other words, things don't contain within themselves the principle of their own being, and so they have to receive their existence from outside of themselves. And what you realize when you think about that is that nothing contains within itself the principle of its own existence. So you could almost say that considered in and of themselves, they have nothing. They are nothing. You know, for example, you know, matter receives the principle of its being from form. Form receives the principle of its being from the act of existence, which makes the entire substance real. But the substance, considered as itself, doesn't have within itself its act of existence. So considered in itself, it's really nothing, isn't it? It only receives existence insofar as it participates in this act of existence, and the act of existence itself is not an existing substance. It is by itself a participation in God's own act of to be. So when you think about things on that level, when you think about contingency on that level, when you think about the radical dependence of that all things have on God, that's an entryway to consider your own dependence on God. It's a way to realize that, you know, there's these spiritual truths about how we're nothing without God. You know, how Christ says, without me you can do nothing. Well, we know that's true in the order of grace, right? Like, we can't do any solitary salvific act without grace. But that's also like a higher manifestation of this truth that's true for everything. Nothing can do anything without its dependence on God. God is the act whereby anything can act. He's the unlimited act whereby anything can act in a limited way. And that is brought about from thinking about things metaphysically. So I mean, you can even probe even deeper into what I just said by breaking it down even further and understanding it on an even deeper level. So, you know, I use words like substance, matter, and form. Well, what do those words mean? Well, again, what is metaphysics? You're starting from the broadest possible vantage point. You're starting from the broadest conceivable perspective, which is being. Well, we know that, you know, being, that very concept, is, you know, obviously one, but we know that in our experience, not everything is, you know, everything is different from one another. So therefore, being has to be considered in, you know, being is one, and yet things are many. So how do you reconcile that? Well, you have to say, well, being is received and limited down into these more constituent parts. So being is received in these ontological units that we would call substances, individual beings. Being, reality, actuality is received in a multitude of individual beings. Okay, well, what makes this being different from that being? Well, you have to say of that two things. You have to say, well, this being and that being are alike insofar as they're both beings, but they're not alike because this being has these characteristics, this other being has these characteristics, and you have to relate those concepts together and say, well, you therefore have to have a principle whereby things are alike and a principle whereby things are not alike. And when you're dealing with multiple beings of the same kind of nature or definition, well, you say, okay, well, they have the same form, that they have the same kind of definition of what they are. So you have multiple different trees, multiple different human beings. But they're different because they're that one form of humanity, or that one form of treeness, or that one form of triangularity, or whatever, is received into individual subjects. Well, that's what we call matter. Matter is the principle of individuation, whereby the common form is individuated into different subjects that receive that form. But so that's kind of the form and the matter. They together make up the substance, and substance is the word for the thing which exists by itself, the thing that exists as a unit, of and by itself as a unit. So, in other words, it's something that exists by a single active being, by a single active existence. And so you think about how reality is composed of these metaphysical principles, but then you probe a little bit deeper and you realize that, well, okay, so let's look at one substance, and you say, okay, well, the form, or rather the matter, receives its actuality from the form, because the matter considered in itself, it can't. It's just a subject that's receiving a definition, namely the form. So the form is nobler than the matter, because the form is going to give matter its intelligibility. It's going to give it its structure, its content, its definitional content, right? But form is only understandable considering it as the form of this matter. Form is meant to complement matter in an existing substance, in an existing material substance. So matter and form together, they relate to each other in the sense that form gives to matter the principle of actuality and structure and intelligibility, but does form and matter by itself, can that make for the actual existence of a thing? And the answer to that is no. Form is form and matter, they come into existence, and they constitute the existing thing, but they don't have within themselves the principle of existence. They have to receive it. And so the very fact that a substance has to receive existence in order to exist at all, what does that tell you? Well, that tells you that the substance does not have within itself existence. It doesn't have within itself the principle whereby it can exist. And so then you say, well, if everything was like that, if all that was real, are just substances, well, then how can any substance exist if no substance has within itself the principle whereby it can exist at all? The result of that is the universal non-existence of all things, which we know is not true. So you have to think about it. Yeah, you have to go back further. You have to keep probing the depths. That's what metaphysics will do. Keep probing the depths of reality until you go to the point beyond which you can't go anymore. And the only logical end to account for the existence of any given thing is therefore a reality that does have within itself the principle of its own existence. And you think about it even deeper. Okay, well, could this reality be itself just like one individual substance? No, because we already established the fact that that substance does not have within itself the principle of its own existence. It has to be perfected by the act of existence in order to exist. So therefore, the only reality that can account for the existence of any given substance is a reality in whom the very substance of that being is to exist. And that's what we call God. God is the pure subsisting act of existence itself. He is the essence. He is that, the essence of which is to exist, full stop, unqualified, no qualifications whatsoever. Everything else is existence limited down to this or that mode of being. Every essence or substance that you encounter is some limitation of the act of existence. It's existence, but it's existence with subtraction. It's existence in this or that restrictive mode. Only a reality in whom existence is unlimited and pure and unqualified in every respect. Nothing but existence. Aquinas uses the term esse tantum, nothing but being, nothing but existence. That is most characteristic of the divine. And so what you've done here is you've started with very base level principles that in themselves don't have much to do with religion or theology or spirituality, but you've encountered very profound spiritual truths by just probing the depths as far as you can go. And that can have very serious ramifications about our spiritual life. So thinking about God as the pure act of existence, right? If God is the pure act of existence, that means he's all powerful. Because what is power? Power is the ability to do something. Power is the ability to reduce something from a state of potentiality to actuality. That's power. Well, if God is the pure act of existence, which is the source of anything that may or may not exist in a finite mode, well, then that means that God is the very principle whereby anything can do anything at all.
So there was a question about that, actually, if not to interrupt you, but so you say that God is existence, right? But he also created everything in existence. He created existence. So how can he be what he also created, if that makes sense?
It's a really good question. So this gets into this distinction between what St. Thomas will call esse commune and ipsum esse subsistens. So that's the common existence and pure subsistent existence. So the difference between those two things is that common existence would be so like backing up a bit when we were talking about substance, right? Each substance has an act of existence. Now that act of existence, though, is in itself a limited mode of being, because the act of existence of any given thing is the act whereby this thing exists, or the act whereby that thing exists. But when you consider what the act of existence is in itself for finite realities, the act of existence is not in itself a substance. The act of existence is that whereby this or that substance exists. The act whereby this or that substance has a presence in reality. But the act of existence for any given thing, again, as I said, is not in itself like an entity that God creates, so much as it is a finite participation in that which is pure existence itself, which is which is God. So God doesn't so much create existence so much as he, as pure existence itself, bestows upon creatures a participation in him.
Gotcha.
So it's not like God, existence, and then things. It's more like God bestowing upon creatures a participated mode of sharing in his own life. And that participated mode is what we will call the active existence of this or that thing.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's the active existence when we're talking about creatures, or esse commune, common being, is that mode of participation whereby things partake of the divine existence in this in various finite modes that are proper to themselves. So I guess that's how I'd kind of deal with that. Was that understandable, or does it need a bit more?
That was awesome. Yeah, that was great. That actually made a
Okay.
lot of sense to me. Pinesap, go ahead. I have 2 more questions, but I'll let Pinesap ask his questions first.
But I mean, if I could like back up just 1 second.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, when I was talking about like power, for example, this is just me kind of emphasizing the point that metaphysical speculation about creation and using those metaphysical speculations to get to the existence of God, you can derive from that what the divine attributes really mean. And that should be able to draw you even more in love with who God is, right? And having an understanding of, like, when we say God is all powerful, what does that really mean in relation to who God is? Well, as I explained a little minute ago, what it means. And it just, I would just say that that's kind of the spiritual significance of metaphysics. And another thing, really quickly, and then you can move on to what you were going to say. When you think about the fact that just the simple act of existing is in itself a participation in it is in itself a participation in God, not of course in the way that the saints participate in God. The saints participate in the inner life of the Trinity, but it is a participation, a very low level participation in the divine, just a simple act of existing. That can lead the Christian to consider each and every single moment of their existence, something that few people really stop and really think about, the act of existing, as in a sense of vocation to holiness. So like every single act, every single divisible act of, or every single divisible moment of your act of existence is a vocation to holiness, because God bestows upon things their act of existence so that they will conform to the similitude or likeness that he has imbued in those things, which is, through the form. The forms of things are reflections of the Logos. They are reflections of God. They are reflections of primarily of the Son of God, who is in himself a perfect image of the Father, right? So the forms of things are what we call similitudes of the divine ideas, which are in themselves finite reflections of God's own self-image of himself from all eternity. So God creates things so that they can manifest his divine perfections and then have a union with him through participating fully in those divine perfections by each thing conforming to its form, essentially, conforming to the demand of its nature. So every single moment of your existence is a vocation for you to partake of that divine perfection that you receive directly and immediately from God. So thinking about things metaphysically, it does have spiritual significance.
Nice. All right, Pintsap, what did you want to ask?
I had a question and I totally forgot it.
Sorry.
No, you're all good. I was trying to think of what I was going to ask.
This is why we write down our questions, Pintsap. That's why we come prepared to Logos Triumphant.
Well, this one kind of came to me, but I was maybe going to ask CT, what do you think would be the best political works that a Catholic could read, maybe by a saint or like church writer? Like, are there any particular books that come to mind in that? Like, I know a couple examples would maybe be like City of God by like St. Augustine or something, but what would be your personal recommendations?
That's a good question. I think you definitely want to read. I mean, of course, go to Thomas, of course. I mean, St. Thomas's commentary on Aristotle's Politics is very good. He has sections of the Summa that detail in the political. I would also recommend, Suarez has a lot of good stuff on politics and natural law in relation to his conception of the state, which a lot of people get a lot of good insight from that. Francisco de Vitoria has a lot of good insights on political theory and international relations. Let me think. I mean, there are, of course. I mean, honestly, I highly recommend. I know this is more recent history, but the encyclicals of Leo XIII, the social encyclicals of Leo XIII, I think are indispensable for a Catholic who's interested in informing his politics with his faith. Leo XIII is essential reading for that. But I mean, what you said like about City of God, that's obviously, that's got to be like number one, for sure.
That thing is massive too. It's like that big.
No, it is, and that's. I think if you read that, then you'll have a really good foundation of the Christian picture of how politics should be, structured. The Church Fathers, of course, collectively do discuss the political a little bit more, sporadically. They're not writing political treatises, so that's kind of the inherent difficulty of saying, hey, read this book about politics from a Church Father. They usually don't do that.
I totally get that.
Yeah,
and
this thing is like 800 pages. Look at this.
Yeah, it's literally massive, dude. It is a tome upon tome. I'm trying to think about... Oh, I got a good follow-up question to that I literally just thought of. So we see CT in sort of, as you mentioned, like the social encyclicals of Leo XIII, like we see this emergence of like the social kingship of Christ, right? And the furthest back I've kind of traced the use of that term was to like Cardinal Pie in like the 1850s. But I wanted to know, like, where do you think really the theology of the social kingship of Christ really emerged in church history? Like, was there a specific father who seemed to enunciate it, or was there like a medieval saint or high churchman that kind of talked about? What would you say on that question?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely get a lot of it from Augustine, certainly. I would argue you also get a lot of it from, Pope Gelasius the First.
Yes.
You get a lot of it from this emerging theory of the two swords that you get from medieval Catholic political thought as well. This notion that that you have the spiritual sword and the temporal sword, and the Pope kind of is able to wield both. And that is articulated, I think, dogmatically in
Unum Sanctum of Boniface VIII. And I think you also have a higher articulation of these truths in Bellarmine as well. Um, I would say the kind of the classical Counter-Reformation authors, they develop Catholic political thought quite well. I'm thinking people like Cajetan, John of St. Thomas, especially upon the discovery of the New World as well. Like I said, with Francisco de Vitoria, he's a pretty people are increasingly becoming aware of his contributions. I've also, I personally have drawn a lot of insight from Robert Grosseteste. The English really like him. The Anglicans try to claim him when they shouldn't. Robert Grosseteste is a medieval theologian, Bishop of Lincoln, and I've been reading a lot of his works, and I find in him there's actually a lot of import, not just for Catholic political theory, but just generally speaking. He will speak of the he will speak of what he refers to as the plenitudo potestatis, which is this idea of the plenitude of power that the Pope is able to enjoy. But he relates this together with really like a medieval articulation of integralism, where the secular order finds its true identity in being subordinated to the plenitudo potestatis, to the plenitude of power. And he gets this from this Dionysian idea that the more universal a cause is, the more it has within itself the capacity to produce effects. So the more universal a cause, the more potent its efficaciousness, the more potent its power. So the person of the Pope is kind of among the most universal of causes of political power, of power in general, because the Pope has absolute universal jurisdiction over the whole Church, and the Church is the mystical body of Christ. So you have this notion of this plenitude of power. So naturally, the more particular, or the more, you could say, local, or the more profane a political structure or a political power, all the more it should be yielding to the higher causes of political power, which is concentrated most potently in the Church. And so you have a basis for integralism by thinking about it in this more metaphysically informed way. Because he gets his notions from Dionysius. Grosseteste is excellent, because Grosseteste is actually a very good. He was one of the first medieval thinkers. I think he was the first medieval thinker to translate Maximus into Latin.
Wow.
Yeah, and then he actually was really interested in trying to reconcile Eastern and Latin thought, and so I find in him a very powerful kind of witness to the great tradition in Grosseteste, and I just find it fascinating that he also has some interesting insights about political theory too. Unfortunately, the Anglicans try to claim him because they will argue that Grosseteste had this run-in with the Pope. He had this conflict with the Pope at the time, and so for that reason, he didn't believe in papal authority. Well, that's not true, because he speaks very explicitly about the plenitude of power and about, he gave this address before Pope Innocent and basically ascribed to him all the powers of the papacy that we as Catholics do. But his issues with the Pope was more a matter of political corruption, not an issue of like theology.
It's kind of like when I think it was like Saint Bruno called like the Pope like some title, and it was like during the investiture controversy. Like it wasn't like insulting him and any of his theology. It was just like how he kind of acted with like a certain emperor or whatever the emperor's name was during
the investiture crisis. Philip IV would call Boniface a sodomite, but was that him denying theologically the power of the papacy? No. Not to say Philip IV was a good guy, obviously not, but it's just to say that sometimes figures will have various skirmishes with popes. But I only say that because somebody like that guy on Twitter, that Orthodox guy, Prime.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, he'll say things like, well, there's evidence of a skirmish between a political king and a pope. Therefore, that political king was really Orthodox, and not really Catholic. When it's like, no, a skirmish, a political battle with the Pope is not evidence that like they didn't believe in the theological powers of the papacy.
Well, it's also like when they'll take venerable.
That would happen all the time. People just don't like political battles with the popes among European princes happened all the time, it's like it's like a constant of European history, where and it's like I mean, sure. I mean, I think today that we rightfully have a more heightened sense of the deference we owe to the Pope, but especially in light of Vatican I. But I mean, just because the Middle Ages didn't really have that sense of deference as developed as maybe we did after Vatican I, they still they still believe that the Pope had the power to like infallibly define doctrine and command the wills of subjects in matters pertaining to his jurisdiction and like all that.
Well, it's so funny because like you mentioned Patriarch Prime, and one of our me and Spex's followers, John Seed, actually like commented or like sent him a comment once on like TikTok, and he was like talking about like the schisms in Eastern Orthodoxy versus Catholicism and talking about how like the papacy wasn't like a uniting factor. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You guys have like so many canonical issues that it's like, where's the true Orthodox Church? Like I can point to Peter and be like, you're in communion with Blessed Peter, Prince of the Apostles, or you're not. It's like y'all have to like get out the googly eye map to figure out who's in schism with who today, right?
Well, look, I mean, I can. The difference is like I can readily concede that the early centuries of the church, a lot of people weren't necessarily fully on board with all the prerogatives of the Pope, just as it took centuries for dogmas pertaining to the Trinity and the Incarnation to fully develop and be articulated as we understand them today. But the fact that those controversies existed necessarily implies the existence of people who did not accept those things at the time. But the Church has the prerogative to decide what is in and what is out. So, like for example, like people might say, "Oh, well, here's a church father who didn't necessarily believe in all the prerogatives of the Pope." It's like, okay, there were also two sides to various early controversies in church history that we all acknowledged have a resolution, but at the time there was a fog of confusion, right? Say the Monothelite heresy at that time. These are very sublime doctrines that at the time admitted the possibility of people disagreeing on how to articulate these mysteries. The papacy is no different. The papacy will our understanding of the papacy will develop and unfold gradually over time throughout the first millennium. But the question really is there evidence in those early centuries of those essential principles of the papacy that are outlined in Vatican I as being present? And I think that there are, like it's not really that radical a claim to make. I mean, it's and so much of it follows logically upon earlier premises. So like just the notion that the institution of the papacy is divinely instituted, or divinely invested.
Oh, absolutely. Like, sorry, I didn't interrupt. Go
right
ahead.
Yeah. Like, well, that's admitted by a plethora of fathers. Like, they always speak of the office of Blessed Peter as being like divinely instituted and whatnot, and that in itself should logically lead to its indispensability. So if you combine divine origin and indispensability, then you get, I think very logically, the notion that, well, then this office can exercise the prerogatives of the church by itself without consent of the church. Okay, if it is divinely instituted and indispensable to the church uniquely, then it should be able, again, we get back to this idea of the plenitude of power. The more universal or the nobler an office, the more concentrated is its ability to bring about the effects of its power. So the nobler the office that Blessed Peter has, which is spoken of by the church fathers and councils, and it's very clear that they saw the office of Peter as noblest, as the noblest office, and even Orthodox will concede some degree of higher nobility, even if it's just I guess ceremonial to them. But the point is, if it is nobler, then it should have within itself the capacity to act of and by itself.
Yes.
And that's the claim of the papacy. The claim of the papacy is that Christ gave the keys to the kingdom of heaven to all of the apostles. It's true. All the apostles received the same charism collectively, but only Peter receives them singly. Only Peter has the ability to use them by himself, and therefore all of the other apostles can only exercise this charism in their communion with Peter. And that's the claim of the papacy, and I think it comes as a result of a very simple logical calculus on the basis of premises that are not too controversial, honestly.
I would completely agree, and on top of that, I mean, you have concessions being made by like Father Richard Price on like Reason and Theology, where he even says like one of the most controversial papal cases that any papal lawyer has ever had to argue is the case of Pope Vigilius. But even Pope Vigilius, like even he, and Father Richard Price says this in this clip that I sent to my channel, that even Vigilius believed himself to be infallible, and no one like disputed his utterances as being infallible, essentially. When he said like, okay, I approve the council, and also I say this thing that's like exactly like what the council is saying, similar to how like the Toma Leo was kind of the same thing as the Council of Chalcedon. And like no, you don't see like any Eastern bishops like rise up against him or anything like that. They're just like, oh, okay, we accept and submit. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty straightforward, I would say.
Absolutely.
So, all right, so I got two more questions. So I wrote this one down. I asked you this in chat, but I thought you gave a great answer, so I wanted to ask you it again on stream. How is God's essence incomprehensible if essence is the definable nature of a thing that exists, like a man's essence is a mortal animal endowed with reason, why couldn't we say that God's essence is the spirit who is the first cause of existence and infinite in all perfections? Is it just because existence is part of God's nature and therefore he isn't a thing that exists? I know you said before like that God is existence as himself, so it's not that other things also exist or whatever, it's that he allows them to exist or brings them into existence or whatever. But how come we couldn't say that God's essence is definable when we have like a definition of like what God is and what his attributes are?
Right, yeah. So definition comes into play when a thing is limited down to this or that mode of being. Definition is, in a way, a constriction of the act of existence. We can only identify something because we in a way are circumscribing it. We are in a way we are taking being, which is in itself unlimited, and it has no limitations, and it has no restrictive and any restrictive definitional content, but we are considering things that are restricted down to this or that mode of being, this or that mode of existence. So a thing has a singular definition that can be immutable, that can be under the analytical scope of our minds, in the measure that it is restricted to this or that mode of being. And for that reason, because the mind has as its formal object universal being, it can kind of circumscribe or go around a thing's definition. Because the mind in its immateriality, like I said, its formal object is universal being. Being is the first known of the intellect. And for that reason, it has at least the capacity to know anything that can fall within that category. But God is not within any category. God is not within any genus. God is entirely beyond any restricted or any restrictive box that you could ever categorize anything in. And that is because, again, like his essence and his existence coincide. The essence of God is to be. The essence of God is simply to exist, unqualified. Now, you can try to define existence, but you would really just be speaking in a circle, because to exist is to be real, and to be real is to exist. And to exist is to be real, and to be real is to exist. And you can use these synonymous terms going round and round in a circle, but existence in itself is unlimited. It doesn't have any limitation to this or that restrictive mode. So on that basis, we cannot limit God by bringing him down to our level of holding him to this or that restrictive confine of definitional content. So that's why I say you can't define God. Now, we can name God, and so like what you've done is say, okay, he's infinite in all perfections. Yes, he is the fullness of existence. Yes, but these positive affirmations are always going to fall short of capturing the fullness of who God is, because he's infinite, because he's lacking in any and all limitations and finitude. So we can name God under a plurality of concepts, under a plurality of names, but each and one of those names is going to fall short of capturing the fullness of divinity. It can be true about God, so it will reflect on who God is. We're not speaking nonsense, and we're also not speaking in mere metaphors, because there's an analogical relationship between the things that God has made and who God is. God makes all things in order to manifest his perfections in these finite, fragmented ways. But that doesn't mean that those fragmented and finite ways don't give us true knowledge about God. It's just that our knowledge about God cannot circumscribe him. Like it's always going to fall short of capturing the fullness of who he is. Now, that being said, in the beatification, because of God's own initiative, he will, by virtue of the light of glory, he will raise our intellects, our rational souls, up to a level that can see him as he is himself, but still not comprehend him. So the beatific vision of God is not comprehension of God. It's knowledge of God. It's direct, immediate knowledge of the divine essence. But according to our mode as finite creatures, so we can never go around God. We can only touch him in a way, if that makes sense.
Got you. Oh, awesome. All right, cool. So last question is, on Twitter or something, I saw you post something that you said, like, God creating humans in the world and stuff, it wasn't necessary, but it was fitting, right? That's something along those lines, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my question is, because I was thinking about this, and like, does it not create a paradox that if God has infinite knowledge of everything, including himself, he's the only, he can only fully know himself, right?
Right.
So if he has
absolutely.
full knowledge of himself and he knows everything that he will ever do, does that not make everything he does necessary and put him in like I know it doesn't, but can you maybe explain why not?
Right.
Like, does it not put him in this box where, like, I know everything that I will ever do, and therefore I can't go outside of everything I'm going to ever do because I already know that. So therefore everything I do is already necessary. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying, and it's a really tricky thing to parse through, right? Because it is, I would concede it is a paradox, but of course a paradox is not a contradiction. A paradox is one of those situations where you have two truths that seem to conflict, but at the end of the day don't. And what we're dealing with when we're talking about necessity in the act of creation, I would start with a quasi concession, in the sense you can speak of it as being necessary in a certain sense, in that God, if he chooses from all eternity to create, then you can say that the creation of the world and his providence over all of creation is necessary for the sake of that end. So it's a relative necessity. It's a necessity of means, but not necessarily a necessity of end. While when we're talking about that initial decision of God to create, I think the dilemma is kind of solved when you realize that God's act of creation, you can consider it in two ways. You can consider the act of creation wholly on the side of God, and when you think about it in that way, well, then you can say, okay, well, if by the act of creation you mean God manifesting himself ad extra, meaning from outside of himself, so manifesting himself in a finite way, well, that is in a way it is a finite reflection of what's always happening within God from all eternity, which is the infinite self manifestation of divinity, which happens in the life of the Trinity. So the act of creation is not an act that's wholly cut off from who God is. It does derive from that same inner divine reality that's always happening within himself from all eternity and forever. So the real question is, okay, the end for which God acts within himself is himself, because he is absolutely simple. So he is his own end, so to speak. He is his own end by which he's glorified from all eternity. So the question is really, is God in his own infinitude, in his own infinity within himself, would he, by virtue of what's fitting, would it make sense to say that he would want to withhold that infinite self-manifestation and self-union from creatures? That same inner divine life, would he want to withhold that from creatures? And we would say it wouldn't be fitting, given who God is in his infinity. God is infinite in himself, and therefore he's infinitely generous within himself. And so it wouldn't really jive with God's infinity and his infinite generosity for him to withhold that from creatures. But is it necessary? In the sense of, does it impose a necessity on God? Well, no, because just because it's wouldn't be fitting for God to withhold that infinite generosity from creatures. By what principle could he possibly be compelled to do so if there's nothing outside of him? In other words, if there's nothing beyond him to impose any kind of necessity, of course there's no necessity imposed upon him to create anything. It is we can understand that it's fitting from all eternity, but it's paradoxically, I admit, but we would say that it's fitting from all eternity for him to freely create. There's really no contradiction between the two. It's counterintuitive. It strikes us as paradoxical, but when you really think about it, where is the real contradiction? Where is it? No one's really able to pinpoint where it is. Like, where it's fitting from all eternity for God to do something, and so he freely chooses to do it. He's not, and freedom doesn't mean necessarily, when we're talking about God, freedom doesn't mean necessarily that God has two totally different options. He can choose A or he can choose B, and so he just chooses A for an indescribable reason. Well, that's not really true, because when you think about what is A and B relative to God, well, they're both reflections of the divine. So in a certain way, they are, like, A and B are they signify the same reality, because they're both finite reflections of who God is. So it's like, is he going to it's not so much is he going to choose A as opposed to choosing B. It's more like there's just God as he is in himself, and there is God as he manifests himself outside of himself according to his wisdom.
Yeah,
and freedom.
Sorry.
And that the end result of that is simply the world that we have today.
So, just to play devil's advocate, and not saying that something compelled him or that he needed to do something because of something else or whatever, what would you say to somebody who would say, well, I'm saying that God limited himself by his infiniteness, if that makes sense? Like, because of his infiniteness, he cannot go outside of that. You know what I'm saying?
I do know what you're saying, and again, like, I can see that it sounds paradoxical, but when you really think about what you said and what it means, it might strike you as if to be unlimited in every respect seems like a limitation in itself. but I think that's just because we're totally incapable of conceiving what it's like to be an unlimited being.
Yeah, true.
And God is so radically free from limitation that it seems like he might be the most constricted being imaginable.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, it is the opposite. And it's kind of like how the saints in heaven, they're so free that again, we kind of are thinking of freedom in the wrong way. We're thinking of freedom in this modern way of just being able to choose this versus that. Whereas freedom in the classical and ancient sense of the word is more like freedom from limitation, freedom from being weighed down by senses or passions or ignoble vice or sin or things like that. But when you are freed from those things, you see the purity of the only true object of your real desire, which is God Himself. And so God is the most radically free, because He's the most radically free from all finitude and from all limitation. So what He sees is none other than His own infinite perfection. And in seeing His own infinite perfection, He also sees all of the ways in which His perfection can be participated in by creatures. And in seeing that, and in seeing also His infinite generosity and radical love, the result of that is simply a lack, well, not a lack, but it's simply not withholding that infinite love and generosity and infinite perfection from those ways in which God can be participated in by creatures according to His wisdom. So according to the best way for all of His divine perfections to be reflected in the created order, which will include the permission of evil, and it will include various the whole story of mankind's redemption, creation being sunken down into the depths of evil and sin, but then being raised up in to partake of the glory of divinity through the incarnation and the mystical body and all that being brought back to God. That's all according to the divine wisdom, and because it's all according to the divine wisdom, it's fitting, and He's also infinitely generous and infinitely loving, and so He wouldn't withhold that from being manifested in the created order. And because He's transcendent of all things, He's not imposed by anything other than Himself to do that. And so that's the freedom, and that's the fittingness, and that's the divine wisdom all coming together in the creation of the cosmos. And the simple inability to pinpoint where the actual contradiction is, I think, is sufficient to say that they go together. It is a sublime mystery that we can never fully wrap our heads around, but it is one of those things that is nevertheless true. It's kind of like, God's justice and mercy. Those things seem to conflict, but the more you think about it, the more you probe into the depths of justice and mercy, you realize they really do go together at the most fundamental level. To be just is to be merciful, but according to a proper order, right?
Right. Oh, awesome. Pinesap, did you have any other questions?
No, I think honestly we covered such a wide swath of territory, and I honestly think I'm gonna have to re-listen to the episode and
take notes,
up a notepad and kind of write. Okay, so this is divine potentiality or whatever, and write it all down. But CT, I always love talking to you, man. You're so knowledgeable. I mean, you are going to just further in the future be such a valuable asset to the church, and I know that one day you'll hopefully by the grace of God be engraved in marble in St. Peter's, and you'll have like
just
a computer.
His PFP.
Yeah, it's
yeah,
PFP.
yeah, just my
You have like
PFP,
a computer in your like left hand, and you're like looking very like buff and stuff like that. Typing away on it. So.
Classical Theist, real quick, not if you're not comfortable.
I appreciate all that, by the way. I really do appreciate those kind words and everything. And you guys are doing amazing work every time you guys go live, and
I appreciate.
I just love your presence, and especially I love the work you do, PineSap and Spexo. I love that you are kind of very like your face is out there as representing America first, and I think that's very, very good for the movement and everything. You represent it very well, I feel.
I appreciate that. That means a lot. I've always loved your stuff, and it's an honor to have you on. Real quick, I wanted to ask, I don't know what you're comfortable sharing or not, so if you're not comfortable, don't obviously say anything, but do you have like any like professional training in like theological studies? Like, did you go to school, or is this like you as just like a layperson?
No, I did go to school.
Okay.
For it.
Right.
That's all I'll say.
All right, good. Yeah, I kind of figured that, but that's awesome. But yeah, man, thank you so much.
But I will say, like, don't let, like, again, I mean, I feel like I know a fair bit of what I'm talking about, but I think that, like, if you haven't gone to school for any of this, don't let that be like a hindrance on you. Most of what I learned in doing actual theology classes, it didn't really factor in too much to, I feel, the most important things about the most important things that I actually learned. The most important things that I've learned about the faith come from entirely outside of the academic context. So, and I'm sure that's true for like all of you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I learned everything I ever known after school. Like in school,
yeah,
I didn't really learn anything.
I mean, it's kind of a joke now, but
yeah. Awesome, man. Thank you so much. We love your stuff. Keep doing what you're doing, and may God bless you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
See you later. All right, that about wraps it up. We're gonna end the episode there. I have to wake up early in the morning, so I'm not gonna do a call-in show. If that's cool with you, PineSap. Sorry about that. We'll do.
Oh, dude, I gotta go good. Too. So you're all good.
Awesome. Yeah. So we'll try to do another episode this weekend or something. Once again, thank you, Classical Theist. You could follow him. He's everywhere: Twitter, Telegram, YouTube. Just type in Classical Theist. As always, God bless all of you.